Thank you, Pastor. So I just want to give a little bit of context to the orders that were published on Monday by the governor, and then kind of talk through some of the highlights. And I'm going to be pulling in members of our panel as I do that to kind of weigh in on the different topics. Let me just share my screen here as I walk through that. So I think as we all know, about 2 months ago, about an order that prohibited rather, churches and other gatherings of more than 10 people. And so that's where we were for about 2 months now. 2 weeks ago, we had about 500 pastors, ultimately, 500 pastors, including, I think many of you who are on the phone here on the Zoom meeting, including Pastor Miranda, signed a letter to the governor that said that, look, churches should be deemed as essential and should be in phase one of any reopening so that people can go back to worshiping God in their churches. Again, doing it safely, but exercising their First Amendment rights to the free exercise of religion and assembly. And I'm happy to say that on Monday, we had the governor's order, which came out and said churches are now permitted to gather up to 40% of their capacity. And we'll be going through some of the guidelines for that. I think that was a very good development. Again, it doesn't answer the questions from a legal perspective or a constitutional perspective. To what extent does the government really have the authority to do things like that? We're obviously in very unique times. I know there are people I've talked to who are still upset that the government is making any sort of regulation of church gatherings, and I certainly appreciate that. But what I hope to do this morning is just to kind of walk through what is on the table right now and how we can go about, in that context, doing it safely, for the immediate future. So there were two main documents that were released on Monday, and I have them up here on the PowerPoint, which hopefully you can all see. One is the order number 33 from the governor that applies to everyone that's reopening in phase one and touches on some of the later phases. But this is some retail, construction, manufacturing, and then places of worship. And as you read through it, the focus is definitely on sort of the business aspect. So it seems to me that places of worship was sort of a late addition to that. I think probably largely in response to the pastor's letters, as well as a lawsuit by a pastor out in Worcester that was challenging the governor's authority of certainly to the old order, limiting it to 10 or fewer in the context of so many other entities being deemed essential and allowed to open. So that's the order. And then each of these sectors that are allowed to open under that order have sector-specific standards or guidelines. And that's the second document that we see on the right. That's guidance coming specifically for churches. And so I just want to walk through the sector-specific church guidance first. And again, we'll pull in our panel here as we go through that. So this is what applies specifically to churches. And then I'll touch on a few things that are general from the order in a minute. So the first thing, and probably the biggest item, is that churches are now permitted to meet indoors at up to 40% of their building occupancy. So, not 40% of your congregation per se, 40% of the building occupancy. I know for some pastors and priests that may be everyone that they're used to having. But again, it has to be done in a context where they can socially distance and keep it safe. And this is relatively consistent with what we've seen recently from other states. Both Virginia and Maryland, for example, opened up churches in their phase one and did it at 50%. So we have 40%. But given the levels of the coronavirus here in Massachusetts, which are relatively high compared to the rest of the country, 40% I think is a pretty workable number, certainly for the short term. So that was sort of the big first takeaway. And just a couple of things, I've talked to a number of pastors, and I'm sure some of the pastors will talk here today. Just because the governor said, okay, you can come back at 40% starting now, doesn't mean they're necessarily ready to start now, either this Sunday or necessarily at that 40%. I know a lot of pastors are going to work up to that. And that was really sort of my goal all along in promoting the churches and is to give them the ability to make those pastoral decisions of the when and the how on their own, and to ask the governor to trust the churches. And I think he has, and so we want to make good on that. The second provision of the guidance for churches is to maintain social distancing. Again, we've been hearing this, for weeks and weeks now, 6 feet apart minimum. And specifically for churches, it says family clusters, family groups can sit together, but then you have to have 6 feet in between where that family is seated. So if you've got pews, probably at least one pew, if not two, in between different people, and space them out laterally. If you have chairs, you can either remove chairs or rope off rows, things like that. And then entering and exiting, reminding us to make sure that we maintain social distancing when you enter and exit a church. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute and probably talk to Rich Elliot from Park Street on some of those logistics. He's the operations director there. But I want to jump ahead to something that I know is on everyone's mind, and that is the face coverings and when and
Andrew,
how does that
let me just
apply?
say one quick thing,
Yeah.
Andrew. Let me just butt in here real quick. If you could just remind people on the translation line to mute their phone, that'd be great. And I think Lou's just saying if we could go a little slower for the translator, that'd be great.
All right, we'll do. I tend to talk too fast anyways, so I'll slow down. And again, as Mike said, if you're on the Spanish language translation line, please make sure to mute your phone.
You want me to say that in Spanish?
Please, yeah, please.
Yeah. Hermanos de habla española, por favor, pongan sus teléfonos en mudo para que no se oigan los sonidos de atrás, ¿ok? Gracias.
Thank you, Pastor. Appreciate that. Okay, so face coverings. This is point 3 in the workplace standards for churches. And we get a lot of questions right out of the gate about this, because the way it reads says all attendees and staff must wear face coverings. However, what about, the pastor? When the pastor is up giving the sermon, do they have to wear a face covering? And again, the way I read it is no, because as you can see in this quote here, yes, attendees and staff must wear face coverings while being inside or while entering or exiting. However, they must do so in accordance with COVID-19 order number 31 and the DPH guidance. So when you read through those two documents, they both require face coverings when you're unable to maintain a distance of 6 feet or more. So as I read that, and again, we'll send out links to these documents, you can look at them for yourselves. It seems pretty straightforward that the intent is cover your face if you can't be 6 feet or more apart. So to answer the question about does a pastor have to wear a face mask when they're giving a sermon or addressing the congregation, if they're more than 6 feet away, particularly if, let's say, the front couple rows are roped off and there's good healthy distance there, I don't think so. And if you look at how it's being modeled by the governor himself, he has almost, I think, daily press conferences, and he's not wearing a face mask when he's speaking to the public and the media. Now, they're all separated more than 6 feet, but that looks very similar to what portions of a church service would look like, logistically, placement-wise. So I think it's pretty safe to say you don't have to wear it. Now, I'd like to just turn it over to James Kulig, who is a physician's assistant at a major Boston hospital. He also serves on the board of Mass Family Institute and is a friend of mine, and I've been talking to him regularly as someone in the medical field to try and better understand this virus and how we can protect ourselves from it. So I want to have him kind of weigh in on the face covering issue a little bit, if he would. James, you able to jump in?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. Also, thanks to everybody for being here. Before I begin, I think I'm legally obligated to say that any opinion that I give today is my own and not affiliated with any specific hospital. But my opinions come from working in Boston and 14 years of experience. So I would agree with Andrew on the face mask issue that when it comes to face masks, as long as you're able to stay socially distanced, which is by definition 6 feet away, you should be fine without a face mask. I think a lot of the questions, the pastor, worship team, as long as you can sort of distance, be 6 feet away, I don't think the pastor or the worship team need to be wearing face masks. I think they should have them on their person for any instance where they would have to come within 6 feet of somebody else. When it comes to the attendees of the church, the congregation, I think the same rules really do apply, where as attendees are entering and exiting, before they're in their seats, they should be wearing face masks, simply because the likelihood of being within 6 feet as you're entering, finding your seat, or exiting is pretty high. Now, as long as there are 6 feet between families, I think you can worship, you can sing, you can sit in the pews without a face mask. Again, having your face mask readily available if somebody should happen to come within 6 feet.
Great. Thank you, James. Appreciate that. And I want to bring in together with you now Pastor Zenzo from Impact Church to talk about the singing issue. So Pastor Zenzo is a good friend. He's also a very talented musician and is both a Dove and Grammy Award nominee in recent years here for some of the praise music he's worked on. So I knew he'd be particularly concerned about the music issue. And Pastor Zenzo, what are your thoughts about how to do music in a way that is safe? I've read some articles, you've probably seen them too, where people are concerned about how singing really, aerosolizes the water droplets and pushes them out there in a way similar to maybe even a sneeze or a cough, and that can really spread around the virus if someone is infected and doesn't know it. What are some ways to address that with worship and music in a service context?
Thank you, Andrew. Talking about singing, I believe in this first phase, we're gonna have to make some changes because when you're singing, you're projecting. But I believe, just like the medical doctor there shared, and I'm not a medical doctor, I'm just a pastor and a musician, but I feel if you're on a stage and there's a good distance, maybe one person who's leading worship could be okay, maybe position them further back. Or you can get creative and do music that's more reflective. Instrumental songs of popular, instrumental renditions of popular worship songs, and be somewhat more reflective in our worship expression. I believe we can get creative and maybe facing the worship leaders instead of worship leaders facing, straight at the audience, maybe sort of in a piano position, facing this way when the audience is this way. And yet again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't know. I'll defer this to the medical doctor there when it comes to congregational singing, corporate singing, everybody in the audience singing. From what I've heard, it's not advisable in this season. So I'd lean more towards someone on stage singing, maybe facing this way or at a good distance, or instrumental music that's reflective. There's something powerful about that type of worship as well, ministering to people in music and versus everybody singing. God can move that way as well, I believe. And so that's what I would say concerning the music. But I also just, Andrew, if I may, I'd like to add some perspective of what I believe God's doing in all this. The Lord has spoken to us that what we're going through right now is a parallel to what the children of Israel went through. They started off in Egypt, then the wilderness, then Canaan. And I believe that what we're going through right now is our wilderness season. And many people have been saying we can't wait to go back to normal. And I believe we're not going back to Egypt. We're not going back to bondage. I believe God is dreaming better, and he has some great things. I believe we're marching forward to Canaan. We're marching forward to a promised land. And I believe we're marching forward to a better normal. And so I just want to encourage someone here as we're working through the details and all the stuff. I know there's so many changes, right? The children of Israel went through changes from Egypt to the wilderness to Canaan. The constant thing was change, but it was changing for the better. They were heading in the right direction. I believe that as a people, as a church, we're heading in the right direction. I believe that people are hungry for God more than ever before. And so as we maneuver these changes, talk about singing and all these details, I just want to encourage somebody out there that I believe that we're heading into our Canaan. What's coming is better. What's coming is greater. And that God hasn't brought us into this wilderness to leave us alone. So be encouraged today in Jesus' name.
Man, well, thanks for that word, Pastor Zenzo. And I hope you're right. I know, again, talking to a lot of pastors, although I haven't been able to gather in person, there's been a lot of excitement about reaching people through these online platforms that we haven't been able to reach before. So hopefully we can continue doing some of the things like that, even as things get back to, I guess, maybe a new normal to some extent. I love your idea of doing instrumental music. That hadn't even occurred to me, but it's obvious. And, it's like going into Chick-fil-A where you hear those praise songs, you know what the words are, but it's just the instrumental, but it can be very powerful. And that might be a sort of an easy solution for a lot of pastors.
May I add something, Andrew?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking, an overarching operational principle that will apply to many different things that we need to project to our congregations insistently is to see themselves individually as, more influential and capable of affecting their environment than they might otherwise be in this situation. So that, for example, when we sing, we don't really normally pay much attention to whether we're spitting as we're singing or we're looking toward the person next to us as we're singing. All of a sudden, I know that my saliva, to be very explicit, does affect people in a very strong way. So when I sing, therefore, realizing the influence that I have upon my environment, I will try to sing less forcefully. I will try to maybe exercise the same kind of care that pastors do before they come to speak. Again, our throats get dry. We tend to speak forcefully, so saliva will come out at times. So, taking a cough drop or something like that will refresh our throat, drinking a little bit of water might be a consideration for those that are near to us and around us and in front of us particularly. And so these different elements of also, when I sing, as you were saying, Zenzo, about the worship leaders, try not to sing directly toward the person that is in front of me if I can avoid it. I think for pastors, we should maybe position our chairs in such a way that they would be slightly diagonal to the other chairs in front, so that maybe as people are singing, they don't have to necessarily be, directing any saliva or anything like that toward the people that are in front of them. So I think this idea of teaching people, hey, whatever you do, however you move, you are potentially having a huge impact on the health of the individuals around us. So keep that in mind always and position yourself and guide your behavior according to that particular understanding. I think that's very helpful for all kinds of different situations.
Thanks, Pastor. That's a good reminder. Absolutely. I want to bring in Rich in a moment here, but I just want to check in with Mike. I'm sure there may be some questions on the face coverings or something like that we should address right now first.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So just go through a couple of these. One is in regard to transportation. So I assume by church vans, what would be the social distancing if you're picking up people and bringing them to church?
Great question. So I actually bumped into this as I was going through the face coverings order and guidance from DPH. And that is when you're in some sort of conveyance, so a vehicle, Uber, public transportation, you're required to wear a mask at that point. So as I read it, that's permitted. But you would want to have both the driver and the people in the car, the passengers, wearing their face masks. Probably sitting in the back seat, just sort of basic, I guess, common sense approach. But that's an area where face masks would be required. Now, again, there's medical exemptions if someone has trouble breathing and has a medical reason why they can't wear a mask. There's an exemption there, but the order and certainly the guidance is, in that situation, wear masks. And I think throughout the orders and the guidance that you get from the government in different churches, people that are 65 and older, just statistically are particularly more vulnerable to this disease. And so it's recommended for sort of everyone in that age demographic to strongly consider staying home. And I say that because I know a lot of times churches will bring folks who are older and maybe can't drive on their own. So for that demographic, I think the recommendation is still very strongly to stay at home at this point. Is there another question, Mike?
Yep. There is a question about liability should someone become sick at church, but I think we'll get to that with Ken Dorothy later in the webinar. Pastor mentioned there's also the option of video worship on the screens so that there's no in-person worship teams, if that's an option people want to consider. And then lastly, do you know when the 40% capacity restrictions will be lifted and which phase does that fall under?
I'll be honest, I don't. I'm not sure if that information is even out yet or if it's been decided. I know there's been a lot of information on phase 1, which we're in right now, but I don't think we have that level of detail on phases 2, 3, and 4. I may be wrong. We'll start looking into that. But as the governor said, phase 1 will be in place for at least 3 weeks. So at this point, we're talking, I guess 3 more Sundays, including this coming Sunday. And if the numbers continue to go down, which we're all hoping for and praying for, then we'll move into the next phases. But we could be stuck in this phase if the numbers spike back up. So for at least the next, essentially, month, we'll be at 40%. But we'll, as soon as we get an analysis of what comes next, we'll put that out.
And then also, what are the guidelines for face masks for children?
Yeah, so we'll send that out. I think it's either if they're under 2 or under 5. It's not recommended. I'm trying to remember which age group it was. I've read through a bunch of different orders. So for young children, they don't recommend face masks.
Under 2, not recommended.
Is it under 2? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I want to move on now to Rich Elliot, who is the Director of Operations at Park Street Church. And I've had the opportunity to work with him for several years now, hosting an event for MFI at the church, and we had, I think, over 500 people last year, and we're going to have maybe close to 1,000 this year, but we ran up against the shutdown. But I've talked a lot of logistics and planning and movement with Rich, so I'm happy to have him weigh in now because that's what he eats and breathes. So, Rich, if you can kind of tell us what you're seeing and thinking and planning with your staff there at Park Street, particularly on getting people in and out of the church while somehow maintaining social distance and whatever else you think would be helpful for pastors to hear.
Sure. Before I do, I just want to weigh in on I happen to have the sheet on my desk, the Department of Health's guidelines on face masks. Children under the ages of 2 years should not wear face coverings or masks. For children 2 years of age and older, a face mask or covering should be used if possible. Mask use by children ages 2 to 5 should be encouraged, but at the discretion of the child's parent. So the other part of that too that we saw in the end, which was sort of exceptions for wearing face masks, include for those that cannot breathe safely, for those communicating with people who rely on lip reading. For those reasons, when we were thinking, because we're a big congregational singing church, in addition, our church choir is in the balcony right over all the people that are sitting on the floor, and there's a lot of concern about that too. We feel like that may give a little bit of room for interpretation there. We are making at this point our plan right now is that everyone that is in the sanctuary, regardless, is going to be wearing a face mask. When the senior pastor will go up to preach, he'll be wearing a face mask. He'll take the face mask off. and then he'll preach. There's really nobody in front of the pulpit, so we believe it's safe to do so. And we're honestly, we're scratching our heads as to what to do with the choir. We have a diminished number of choir. We're considering having them be in different rooms. We're considering them be in the rear of the balcony, putting up a polypropylene sort of guard to protect people below. But we're a big congregation hymn singing church, and there's at this point I think just too much concern about what might happen. So we're going to be asking people to keep face masks on all the time. If you like singing as much as our church likes, you'll realize that it's difficult in the mask. It is, it's difficult to breathe in a mask, and particularly for a preacher, I think it's very impractical because you don't want your pastor passing out. Our general process has been there's two different conversations that are happening. I was tasked with coming up with just a logistics. It's kind of following along the 1 Corinthians 10:23. Everything is permissible, but not everything is edifying. Let's start and think about what are we permitted to do. So when I did that, I just sat down with, you can actually see a floor plan of our sanctuary, and just thought about, if we're going to do this, where are people going to sit? How are things going to work logistically? And if I was going to come in, how would I come in and do so in a way that encouraged social distancing at all times? They would have to come in through, only one of our doors, because one of our doors has a ramp and is ADA compliant. They would have to come into one of our large rooms. Our large room would have to be empty. So I'm sorry about that. Michael, I'm trying to slow it down a little bit here. I realize I talk fast too. We believe that everyone has to submit to a healthcare screening. We have a number of people in the healthcare community that are part of our congregation and asking certain questions. At this point, there's no direction on having to take temperatures. But we believe that if you are exhibiting any symptoms of COVID, if you present an increased risk, that you need to not be there. Certainly those people that are immunocompromised or elderly need to think about whether they're going to be there. So there's a screening process whereby for us, it would start outside. We're going to be having a sign, or we'll put it in our bulletin and online, which is a QR code. And that QR code, once you take a picture with your phone, it'll direct you to a healthcare screening. So in the car on your way to church or whatever, your family can sort of fill out their healthcare screening. When they come, it's reviewed with somebody, and then they say, great, you don't have a fever, you're feeling wonderful, you're good to come on in. And then they can come on in and proceed in the main area up to the sanctuary. You really have to, this is a part where your facilities manager or your operations folks are really going to be instrumental in thinking about, directing. You really want to direct the circular path. So we'll have them walk through the Welcome Center and up to the sanctuary, and they enter through the back. When they leave through the front. Our narthex, the rear narthex sanctuary table will have a basket for collecting offerings. And in addition, anyone that is, has an offering to give, as they exit through the front, there will be offering baskets as well on the right and the left, but we will not be collecting offering in a physical way. There's a lot of discussion going on about the Sacrament of Communion right now. And that I don't really have a whole lot of wisdom on that at this point. That's more of a ministerial question.
Rich, if I can jump in just for a second, I wanted to share, if that's okay, this, I think the form, a Google form that you had shared with me. I think that's the initial screening you're talking about. If you can see that.
So it's a basic question. It was developed with our healthcare personnel because we do believe at this early stage where there is a lot of concern, and if there are cases of COVID that are being that are coming about as a result of being in your church, the Board of Health is going to be involved, which is, I believe, some form of contract tracing. When did you contract the disease? Who are you sitting near? Who else was in the sanctuary that day? We're going to need to contact them. So that is just a simple Google form. It dumps into a big bank, but it enables us to kind of look through things, sort through things. And if we need to know anyone that worshiped or in our church, including staff, including musicians, anything, We have contact information to be able to get back in touch with them.
Thanks, Rich. And you also mentioned, and this is actually another one of the specific items in the guidance for churches, to modify the means of collecting donations or offerings. So, no more passed in the basket. I know the church I go to already just has these sort of black metal boxes at the exits that you can drop your check or donation into. Obviously, a lot of churches can receive donations online, so they're encouraging that, which I think is a lot simpler fix than the communion or the Eucharist. Now, so we'll get to that in a minute. But I wanted to bring in now Pastor Marlene Yo from
Andrew.
April. Yep.
I just want to briefly piggyback up on what Rich was saying.
Yeah, please.
And I think people should take what he said very seriously. What he described is exactly what the hospitals are doing. And it's a great way. You're not going to catch everybody, but it's a great way to, number one, protect your congregation. Number two, protect your church. I'm sure you get your liability. Whereas if, like you said, if somebody gets sick, the DPH will be involved. You can very easily say, here are our standards. We've modeled them after what hospitals are doing, which is exactly what hospitals are doing. They're screening every worker and everybody who walks in the front door. It's another level of protection against, the DPH shutting churches down again, if you will. But what Rich is doing are hospital standards of screening, which is fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, James. It's a lot to try and process, but I mean that's why I guess they have these consistent guidelines. And it is good to do a pre-screening if you can. And Rich, that was just a Google form, if I understand correctly, that you all put together and feeds into a spreadsheet.
It's free. I mean, it's free. We created it. And then the people that are administrating that Google form actually can see all the respondents in real time. So if somebody's in their car and they hit send, you can actually be looking at it and pull it up right away. And if there's a concern, if somebody has symptoms that are consistent with COVID or whatever, you can say, thanks, but we're going to ask that you refrain from worshiping with us today. Can I just have like one more minute?
Absolutely, yeah.
So once we've done that, kind of determined a pathway, I've created sort of a narrative and a script of just kind of how somebody comes in to the church, how somebody gets up to their seat. We put a bulletin on each spot where people can sit with social distancing. You have to have ushers trained because right now the picture that I showed you of our sanctuary indicates that one individual would sit in each place. However, that's going to change if you have a family of 4 or 3 couples of 2 or a family of 3 and a family of 5. So the ushers are going to have to be well versed in seating people, probably sequentially and systematically. And then when they go forward and then they leave the church, then you have to you're going to have to sanitize the church. We have 2 services, an 11 a.m. and a 4 p.m. service, and you're going to have volunteers. So when I looked through that whole narrative script for my day, I could kind of go through and say, okay, I'm going to need 5 people here, 4 people here. I'm going to need about 12 volunteers, 2 healthcare professionals, ministers and staff. And then you can also go through the whole thing and you can create a communications checklist. We're going to need signs on all the bathrooms that say for emergency use only, or this is not a stairwell, or have directional arrows. And then also you can go through that whole thing and then you can start to think about, okay, well, what are the supplies I'm going to need? We're going to need sanitizing buckets, and we're going to need extra face coverings or Purell or things like that. So once you do that document, you can kind of just run through it and you can sort of sift it for, the things you have to shop for, the signs you have to make, and then the volunteers and then the staff that you're going to have. And the last thing I'd say is just we also realize at this time, when you come into a sanctuary and you're worshiping with people in a socially distant way with masks, or you haven't been in a sanctuary, the first thing I did on Easter when I was working on Easter and I was blessed to be able to be in the church, I cried. It was overwhelming to not have the whole church there. as well. So you're going to want to have elders and deacons and staff there to really help people, because there's going to be an emotional transition. And then the last thing that I would just say is, every person that's going to come in and sit in your sanctuary, there are probably going to be one or two people that have not been out of their house. They may not be able to come and worship with you. So in the effort to want to go back to in sanctuary worship, just realize that there are a lot of people that are not there yet. And I think the primary response that we need to have as churches is, we're not really interested in the 10% that can come into our church. We're interested in the 100%, wherever they are. So making sure to have, vigorous social media, and continue your online classes, continue your virtual groups, continue your Zoom discussions and your children's education that's happening remotely, because those things are going to be vital for quite some time.
That's definitely a good reminder, Rich. And I think when you and I chatted earlier, and this is true of some other pastors, people were thinking about starting this reopening process at a much lower number, almost like have the staff and the deacons and the pastor there, but maybe a very, very small gathering, just to kind of work through all these logistics and which door do you go in, you exit maybe a different door, or the arrows on the floor in the right direction, all that stuff. Is that something you guys are considering, starting small and kind of getting it worked out?
Yeah, I mean, for all the things that I've shared, Park Street is really determined at this point that we're a couple of weeks away from being able to open up our doors. We want to do it right, and when we want people to come in, we want people to come in a safe way that we can sustain. So as much as I would love to throw the doors open on Sunday, we're not there yet, and I imagine that we're going to be phasing that in slowly. 15% of our capacity, our capacity is 890. In social distancing, we can fit about 130 people in. So we're not going to hit the 40% mark. But this is a work in progress. This is definitely a work in progress for everyone. I also think one thing is, whoever's coming up with plans, peer review, shop it around to other churches or other deacons or elders or your facilities manager, people that know the church really well, because they're going to look at that plan and they're going to go, oh, you forgot about this one entrance, or you want to think about this. So yeah, I mean, if I can be a resource to anyone, I'm happy to give anyone my contact information. So.
Great, thanks, Rich. And I do want to get to Marlene, but first, I'm sure there are some questions for Rich. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So let's go through some of these questions. First, Rich, if people want to get a template of that Google form, can they contact you directly, or what's the best way to do that?
You can contact me directly. Yeah, I'll put my contact information on, or if you want to send that in an email, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay, so is there a form, a template, like a link that people can just kind of copy and paste that you could send to me?
Yep, I did.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I will.
All right, so and just so everyone knows that's watching, we'll send out a follow-up email. We're recording this this morning, so you'll get a recording, and then also all this important information you'll get as well. Andrew or James, I guess, what constitutes a medical exemption? I'm hearing of people saying that they have anxiety while wearing a mask. I know we can't ask anyone about their medical conditions, but is this something we should worry about?
James, if you want to jump on that, I'll pull up the orders and sort of give the chapter and verse, but if you can address it from, again, a medical perspective.
Sure. I think anxiety will probably be one of the grayer areas when it comes to mask. Anxiety certainly is a medical diagnosis, and if a person reports that they have enough anxiety where it causes them shortness of breath and panic attacks and severe anxiety, then you certainly could not tell that person that they're lying, or you couldn't make them wear a face mask because of it. Again, that would be in the gray area as far as a medical condition, if you will, although it is real.
And thanks, James. And I'm trying to share, I think it'll pop in a minute. Okay, so this is know if that's big enough, but this is the Department of Public Health guidance that goes with the face mask order that's in place right now. And if you see those bullet points, I think number 2, behavioral health, probably would cover my guess would cover the anxiety. Again, someone can't breathe safely. Interesting, the lip reading one. I know some friends who really rely on lip reading in order to sort of augment some hardness of hearing that they have. I guess that kind of goes the other way. When I first read that, I said, well, okay, that definitely means that pastors, when they're preaching, shouldn't have to wear a mask. And that's before I got into the weeds on the 6-foot separation, which I think covers them anyways. So those are sort of the main expected, anticipated exemptions. Again, when you can't be more than 6 feet apart. And I know I read somewhere, whether in the order or here, that you don't have to have like a doctor's note to prove it. I mean, you're allowed to take people's word for it. So hopefully that answers that question. Mike, are there others?
Andrew, yeah, can we do service at the parking lot to fit more people since our occupancy is only 155 inside the building?
Yeah, in fact, parking lot, drive-in services have always been permitted under the letter of the order. And I know my church and I think a number of others on Easter had drive-in services. So if you've, got a parking lot, that's one way you can do it. And it doesn't have to, at this point, it doesn't have to be in cars. It could be people kind of spread out, maybe on a big church lawn. Again, as long as you're maintaining that social distancing, the way the orders read, that's permissible. And so then you wouldn't have a percentage cap or a numerical cap. It would just be how many people can safely congregate in that parking lot or lawn while maintaining social distancing. And I think just probably best practice is, if you're going to do that, because it's going to be highly visible, it's probably good to just check in with your local authorities as well, let them know you're planning on doing that, which I know a number of churches did for the Easter drive-ins, and for the most part, that went very well.
Okay, what would you recommend regarding ushers encouraging use of hand sanitizer as one enters the church?
So that's also in the orders. Let me just jump ahead. We'll go back to the other one. So churches are required to have, as you can see here, hand washing facilities. So to me, this brings up the question of bathrooms. Most churches, if they're going to have soap and running water, it's going to be primarily in their bathrooms, maybe also the kitchen. But there's nothing in the order that specifically deals with whether bathrooms can be open or closed. So I think it anticipates bathrooms being used. I know a lot of churches, when they did the drive-in services, the building was closed except to a skeleton staff that was, running the AV stuff, mics and the sound. And I remember, going to that Easter service and thinking, are we going to make it with 4 kids, including a 4-year-old, and not use the bathroom? And we did. But I think, so under this new guidance, bathrooms are permitted, but obviously that's a concern. So I don't know, maybe if Rich, if you thought through that, or if any other pastors have thought through bathrooms, but certainly I think it's recommended to have those hand sanitizer stations, located near doors, certainly, and elsewhere, just as sort of good general practice. James, Rich,
generally speaking, whenever we have people go through the screening process to be approved in, the last thing that they do is they get sanitizer. The first thing that they do is get sanitizer. To be perfectly honest, the liquor store in Stoneham has bottles of grain alcohol, but they sell it with a vegetable glycerin. You can make your own Purell. I know supplies are hard to get, yeah. So people are being creative. There are some creative solutions for how to do that.
The guidance is 60% alcohol, so that'd be 120 proof, I guess, for your hand sanitizer.
There you go. But yeah, I think that having hand sanitizer along with hand washing, they're really discouraging the use of bathrooms for just general, like to go in and primp or put on your makeup or comb your hair or anything like that. So we're designating ours as emergency use only. Okay. So I think that the primary way of sterilizing or sanitizing your hands ought to be hand sanitizer.
Yeah, that
But
makes
Andrew,
sense. Yeah.
what happens if the pastors and deacons are 65 or older in terms of staying home?
So, yeah, great question. There's nothing in the order that requires people over a certain age to stay home. Obviously, that's sort of the general recommendation. But that's going to be, I think, up to the pastors and deacons to make that call. James, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think all of this is about risk reduction. We know who high-risk people are. And if a pastor or deacon is in the high-risk group, meaning above 65, and it's really their choice to go. They can also, they can modify what they do, meaning they will go and then preach, but they will have no contact with people. And that's really up to each individual church and each individual of how much, risk that pastor or elder is willing to take on being in a quote high-risk group.
Good, thanks. So I'd like to get
also, Andrew, would it be mandatory to take people's temperature?
That is not in the order. I mean, I've seen that in a lot of sort of the guidelines and recommendations, but if reading through the order and the standards for churches, that's not in there. But again, it may be something that you choose to do as part of the sort of in-processing. Is that something any of the pastors here are planning on doing with the sort of forehead thermometer, I guess?
We may do that. And, there are thermometers that are also at a longer distance. It doesn't have to be so invasive. You have to point it right at the forehead of the person. There are others that are more sophisticated. You can do it kind of discreetly, actually. So that's another possibility. While letting people know that you're doing that, of course. But,
right. And then I guess you have to weigh, is that going to create even more of a backup when you're trying to have people come in at that 6 feet or more? But it's not a requirement at this point. I'd like to ask Marlene, Pastor Marlene, to share with us kind of her process and her thoughts. She pastors a church up in Haverhill, and I know a lot of pastors on this call are in that probably 75 to 200 range, and maybe have a facility that's not the size of Line of Judah or Park Street, and don't have sort of the same size of staff. So how do we do all these things that we need to do if we're going to reopen church with maybe a smaller staff and a tighter facility?
Well, actually, we're in a really unique position because we've been serving our city since 1999 as far as the low-income distressed population, having a food pantry. The city deemed us essential from the get-go. So we haven't had some of the challenges that a lot of the churches have had. When we were opening our food pantry, thanks to Pastor Lori Jane Sima and Numsa Nube, they came up with being very mindful. Numsa is in the medical realm, and Pastor Lori Jane is very conscientious of people's safety. And so we're aware, because of the Merrimack Valley Food Bank and a lot of the guidelines that we've had for serving people, we implemented. And so we were from the get-go in a very good position to be able to serve our city. There was an undercover cop that came our first food giveaway, and it was a wonderful experience that we had. He checked us out to see how we were functioning. We had over 28 volunteers in our building preparing the food, taking it outdoors to put it in people's cars. He commended us for being distanced and being serving carefully and all of that stuff. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for us as a staff to feel at ease, where a lot of churches haven't had that, to be able to feel that they're really doing well, and that the city is recognizing that what they're doing is essential. And so because of that, we never completely eliminated church, except for one Sunday, the initial Sunday when everybody was in shock when they said the doors are closed. But after that, what we were doing is Facebook Live and meeting with our staff on a regular basis, meeting for prayer, small groups, meeting in homes with small groups, covering the elderly, covering the Hispanic that needed translation, covering men, women's groups. So still meeting with people in small environments. But what we realize is that a lot of the people in our congregation are not ready to re-enter into. So we're not sure, now that, quote unquote, the governor has said we can meet up to 40%, we're not sure how many people are actually going to come. But because there is no children's ministry and there's no hospitality, we're able to divide our staff so that we can actually offer 2 services. So we can do double the amount in a Sunday by offering 2 services. So we're very grateful for the staff that we have. We've met all along. We've discussed policies all along. We've made sure that we're not just together in unity in word, but we're together in oneness in purpose. So there's absolute community and unity among our staff. So because of that, we've been able to maintain a very steady forward movement throughout it all, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, that's wonderful. A good point. Reminder on the food bank ministry. So that's actually a specific exemption in the order to the general prohibition. Let me if I pull it up here on fellowship or communal meals. There's an exemption if you're doing like a food pantry, food ministry. That you can still continue to do that, obviously with safety precautions. But otherwise, we're not supposed to have, coffee hour beforehand or fellowship afterwards, which is disappointing. But obviously, we can see why. But I just want to get back to the issue that's in line with this in the section 4 of the standards that Rich touched on, and that is communion. Now, this is an encouragement or a guidance, not a directive. If you look at the order, and there's a PDF version that's sort of like an infographic. It actually splits them up between what is sort of a directive or an order and what is guidance or encouragement, recommendations. And I guess the recommendations are in gray and the rest are in sort of the white background. And we'll have that as a link to share with you. Maybe I'll try and pull it up in a minute as well. But I was happy to see that the communion portion was a recommendation. And I mean, obviously, depending on what type of church you're pastoring, some churches do it very differently. So they've left it up to the individual churches to figure out how to do that and just to, maintain as much distance and separation and lack of touching as possible. Panelists, any thoughts on how to do communion in this context?
Yeah, we've been serving communion when we're together as a small group. And so the person that's serving it is masked and has gloves. They take the bread, they dip it in the cup, and then they put it on a napkin in the hand of the person. And the person leaves that space, goes to their chair, and then takes it there. So that seems to work for us.
Okay, so there's no actual contact between the two individuals. You got the napkin and the gloves. Okay.
Right.
And since you've been doing this sort of all along, how have you guys been doing music, Marlene?
Videos. Thank God for videos.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Let's see. Want to make sure we're covering everything here. As Marlene mentioned, so nurseries and childcare have to remain closed. So it doesn't get really into specifics on that, but my impression is that would include like a children's church. If families come in and they're seated all together as a family, a lot of churches, including mine, sometime before the sermon, we dismiss the kids to go to children's church. My sense is the intent is that needs to not happen for now as well. It's one thing for me to keep my 4-year-old sort of with me. I can kind of keep a handle on her. But if you've got a dozen 4-year-olds down in the church basement with 1 or 2 teachers or volunteers, that there's no way you can do social distancing.
So we've done once a month so far. We've been doing a drive-in service so that families can come in their car. And what we do is we hand a goodie bag for each child in the car so they have a snack, a drink, and an activity to be able to do. And then we do live worship outside for that once a month. And then that way they're able to drive with their family to church and receive blessing. Plus we also put groceries in their trunk and hear live worship. And that has been a great encouragement. And we continue to do that throughout the summer. We're going to do that once a month. So therefore, once a month, people outside, people inside, people on the side. And so to the best of our ability, trying to make something for everybody happen at least once a month.
Well, that's a neat way to do it. So tailoring different services on different Sundays to kind of facilitate different demographics in your members.
Right.
That's good. Yeah. Section 6 here, cleaning, disinfecting, and hygiene. Just want to touch on the fact that I know Rich mentioned we're directed to clean, sanitize the facility in between every service. So if you're doing multiple services on any given day, you have to factor in time for that. Any thoughts or experience on that from the panelists?
My only addition would be that there was part of me that was, you know, on a Sunday night when I was getting ready to leave, I thought, oh, I just really want to go and go home and collapse. But we really want to have a commitment to clean and disinfect the areas where people are sitting by the time we close our doors on Sunday night, because our church sextons, our facility staff, or your sextons or facility staff are the people that you really rely on most, and I don't want to give them a potentially contaminated environment. So, you know, we're going to be relying on a lot of volunteer staff, but, you know, wherever people have sat in pews, bathrooms, surfaces, counters, tables, and pull as many tables, chairs that you don't need. It's one less thing that you have to clean. And if you have stanchions or cordons or tents of barriers where you can just sort of block off a building, a wing, a room, or something like that, lock those areas off. As much as we would love to have Christian formation classes or Christian education or other things happening, now's just not the time. I mean, we want to try to do worship right. And then after that, we can talk about having committee meetings and all the other things that happen on a Sunday. But again, I think to phase this in and not try to hit the ground running full tilt, it would be tough all the way around.
Yeah.
Andrew, may I?
Please.
May I interject here? Yeah, and so a lot of information here. I know there's a lot of pastors on this line today, and it's amazing to hear all the details that you're doing there at Park Street and how you're preparing all this amazing stuff. But I'm also always thinking about, you know, the smaller churches who may not have the advantages or even the resources to do some of these things we're talking about. I want to encourage someone out there to say that it's an amazing and a powerful statement that the governor said we can open our churches. But I want to say to someone out there, if you're not ready, let's preserve the testimony of the church. Let's not be in a rush. The Church of Jesus is alive and well. The church is reaching more people today than we were pre-COVID-19. And so I know for us, maybe we are also uniquely positioned. We have a lot of young people doing a lot of services online. God opened the door for us as well to be on Fox TV once a month. And we're going to be on there until September. And here's the thing. There are people that are being saved today. There are people that are online. The most unlikely people, I don't know about you guys, but I've seen family members I've been trying to get to church for years that are finally watching our services and giving their lives to Jesus. And so I want to encourage everybody here. We are one church, and the Church of Jesus Christ is strong today, stronger today, together. And so please, if you don't have the resources to do all these things, I'd really say let's wait. Let's not be in a rush. No pressure. Let's preserve the testimony of the church. If you can, please do church virtually. Even if we're open in our buildings at 40% capacity, there's still a lot of people that are back home that we have to reach. And I want to offer myself as a resource. This is our area of strength when it comes to the technical aspect, going live, and the virtual aspect. If we can assist you, I want to provide my information as well. But the other thing I wanted to say is I also believe that as a church, we have the privilege and the opportunity to lead the world in a season like this. The world is watching. As the church goes, so does the world. And so they have to see wisdom. They have to see a wise church. This is the day of the Daniels to arise. They have to see that the church is wise. I would hate to see us be in a haste, and then 2 weeks later, a month later, the governor is shutting us down. Let's preserve the testimony of the church. The Church of Jesus is alive and well today. Crisis has always been a setup for greatness. Crisis has always been a setup for the gospel to be preached. The early church was persecuted. In the midst of that, they spread at an accelerated level. So let's be at peace. If somebody's is worrying them, if you don't feel ready to start this Sunday, be at peace. Jesus says, I will build my church. He is building the church, and his church is alive and well. I also feel like we need to focus on helping people grieve. I believe that it's okay to grieve the change. There are many losses. There are many changes. Doesn't make anybody any less of a Christian to grieve the change. The Bible says there's a time to heal, time to laugh, time to grieve, time to be born, time to die. And so I believe even virtually, like right now, over 200 people registered for this. I believe we need to focus on helping pastor the people, care for the people, helping them grieve the change. People have lost their weddings, and weddings that didn't happen, graduations that didn't happen, all these things. Life is being redefined, right? And so I feel like if we can focus on strengthening our people and caring for them, helping them to be strong, by the time we reopen for the masses, we'll have a stronger and a greater church.
Thanks, Pastor Zenzo. That's again a good reminder, and I want to echo that by sort of promoting this, what we see as good news, that the governor is letting us go back to church up to 40%, that we're not trying to rush anybody into something that they're not ready for. I think it was either Mike or I got an email on Monday morning after we sent out that announcement from a pastor who said, oh, now my people are going to want to come back to church on Sunday, which is kind of an ironic statement for a pastor to make when you take it out of context. But we get it, right? I mean, it's a lot of things to think and plan through, and we're happy that we have the ability to do it when and how we feel called to do it when we're ready. But we're not trying to rush anybody. We just wanted to, quickly put this webinar together to help people start planning, and whether that's for this Sunday or 2 Sundays from now. That's I've said from day one, that's a pastoral decision. We're just trying to make sure that legally you have the right to make that on your own.
If I may,
If
I may, I just want to take a moment, Andrew, and thank you and MFI for doing this. I just believe this is so important, and it's a powerful thing that the governor has allowed the church. I believe it's a powerful statement, and I'm celebrating this. I'm so glad this happened. Thank you for always being a voice. Thank you for doing that. This is so needed. Thank you. So important. It's a powerful statement, especially this happening in Massachusetts. It needed to happen. It's a statement that the Church of Jesus Christ is always on the forefront, and so needed. With that said, like Andrew shared, let's use wisdom. I believe this is going to open opportunities of being creative and doing certain things that we couldn't do a week before. This is good. This is amazing. But let's use wisdom.
Pastor Zenzo, if I could just speak to that as well, just so pastors understand. As you said, this is a great victory in terms of religious liberty to trust the church, right? To be safe, just like other retailers. And just so pastors know, because of the work that we've done together over the past 2 weeks, we've had over 500 pastors sign a letter. We've had over 600 people, maybe close to 1,000 actually, but definitely over 600 people click on the comment section of the Reopen Advisory Board Committee website, and I think that was powerful. We've had hundreds of phone calls to the governor, and there's just been many different things that have been going on behind the scenes, and I think it just shows the impact and the influence that the church can have when we do come together, like we have over the past couple weeks.
All right, thanks, Mike. I know I just looked at the clock, and we're about 20 minutes out from noon, and so I want to go through a couple things quickly here. I'll stay on as long as it takes, but I know everybody else is really busy, so I want to be a good steward of your time. But there are some important things to touch on here. Let me just share my screen one more time when we go through these orders. And the first one is notifying the local boards of health if there is a positive corona case of either your staff or attendees. And I know when I first looked at this, again, I'm a lawyer, so when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Seemed like a bit of a red flag to me, potentially from a legal perspective. I know some other pastors and attorneys were concerned by it. I can't tell you if this would actually be enforceable, given sort of medical privacy issues and sort of pastor penitent confidentiality. But that is in the workplace standards. The churches are supposed to notify their local boards of health if they hear from someone in their congregation, staff or attendee, that they've tested positive, so they can do the contact tracing. Again, I think most pastors want to be sort of good neighbors, have a good relationship with the local community and local authorities, and cooperate with them. And I would assume that most attendees and staff would feel that way as well. So, probably the very real potential legal objections to something like this, could be waived by the individuals in the efforts of just kind of all working together to fight this virus. But that is in there and did catch my attention. Any specific questions to that, Mike? I know we talked about that yesterday. And if one comes up, you can jump in. I think those were, all right, so number 8. This is actually from the order that applies to all businesses and organizations that are reopening. And it talks about having to certify that you're ready to reopen. Well, what does that look like? There are 2 sort of certification documents that can be found on the governor's website for reopening, and we're going to send out a link that has that. But there's really not a whole lot to them. Let me just swap my screen share here. Okay. All right, so this is if we can see this now, is it sharing? Okay. This is a 2-page certification document. So as I understand it, looking at the order, looking at what's on the governor's website, churches, as well as every other entity that opens up here in phase 1, is supposed to fill this out. Again, I know this kind of raises a red flag with me as an attorney, and also I think some pastors may be not comfortable with that, because here's the government telling you got to certify that you're ready. That being said, it's pretty bread and butter. When you go down it, it's your basic church contact info, and then you literally are just checking boxes that you're going to do all the things that we've been talking about churches wanting to do to be safe and cooperate all morning. So there's that. And then once you do that, there is this poster. You sign this. Yeah, that you kind of check this. Someone from the church signs it, and that's supposed to be posted in the church. And I just closed it. All right, so the other document I showed you, that's that 2-page sort of plan, that's supposed to be kept on file at the church. Again, we'll send you the links out for these things.
Now, Andrew, is this referring to the church as employer? I mean, it seems that the language here refers more to businesses.
Well,
the church could be considered that, but I get the sense that the intent of this is more regarding businesses and churches in their capacity as employers, not necessarily pertaining to dynamics of service, attendance, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's not crystal clear. When you read the order, churches are in there, but I think the main emphasis of the order is on businesses. So there are some places where, churches are not specifically spelled out. Again, we'll be sending out the link to the main website that has these documents. My sense is that the compliance certification is required for churches, but that it consists of, I think at most, these couple of pages. And there's a couple different formats. I may have grabbed the wrong one, but they're all very similar, whether it's employer or sort of a business. And again, even that is sort of problematic. MFI was engaged, even with some of the folks on the phone now, in a legal effort to make sure that churches weren't lumped in with public accommodations, because they're not the same as a business. But I think just in the hurry to get all this stuff out from the state, that's kind of how it reads. Now, there's one last item I want to touch on, and then we'll open up for sort of final questions and thoughts. All right, and that is local authorities. So I've heard from a number of pastors that, including one who was trying to do a drive-in service a couple weeks ago, or I guess for Easter, another pastor in Dedham who was trying to hold, he's a small church planter, so he said, look, I can fit basically everybody if I have 2 services of about 8 or 9 people. And he told the local authorities that's what he was going to do, and they ordered him a cease and desist, or they issued a cease and desist order, even though he was in compliance with the existing order at that time. Both of those objections to the drive-in service on Easter down in the Cape and the sort of micro services in Dedham came from the local boards of health. And what I was sort of pleased to see, and I want to make sure you all knew, in the order that applies to everybody, not just churches, that's in phase 1, is that local authorities are not supposed to change or make more strict the guidance coming from the governor for churches reopening. So I think it's good, obviously, as a good neighbor, a good citizen for the church to be in contact with the local board of health, and the police as well, just let them know what you're doing. But they do not have the authority to say, well, the governor's order says 40%, but I only want you at 20%. They can give recommendations or encouragement, and you're obviously more than welcome to work together with them. But they do not have the authority per this order to change or make more difficult what the governor has established. And because I know we've got pastors who are in Boston on the line here, I just saw this morning, I can get the next slide here, from Mayor Walsh. He issued some guidance. Some of it touched on churches. These are quotes from his email. So encouraging churches to be cautious, encouraging seniors not to go to church yet, and specifically asking for churches not to do singing. Again, these are all requests. He doesn't have the authority to direct this, but that just came out in an email that was forwarded to me this morning from Mayor Walsh's office, is what he's looking for, given the density of the population in Boston and the numbers that they're seeing there.
So Andrew,
yeah,
if I could address a few issues on the liability and dealing with churches for so many years, I can see some liability cropping up from this situation.
Sure. And again, this is Ken Dorothy. He's worked with us. He's with Brotherhood Mutual. And they've got a great website. We'll be sending that link out with guidelines for churches. So I just want to make sure everyone knew who you were, Ken. Does church insurance with Brotherhood Mutual.
Sure.
Please go ahead.
And what is important is for us to be following the guidelines that is set out by the state as close as possible. Because if we're not doing that, and something happens in one of our churches where somebody gets really sick, okay, or God forbid even passes, the lawsuit could come back and say, look, they didn't do what they were supposed to do by what the state outlined, and could hold the church liable for what happened, okay? Now, the insurance policy normally is going to pay for the attorney fees, but the actual judgment, if there is one, it will not pay for. But so it's important. Like I've heard all sorts of things, like for instance, is that hymnals shouldn't be in the pews. They should be taken away. Because, I mean, the job of cleaning every one of those in between services is going to be a hard job, you know, along with like visitor cards, pencils, things like that need to be taken out. The other thing is that churches are closing down their bathrooms. They're saying, hey, look, this is an hour and a half, you know, unless it's a real emergency, you know, these bathrooms are closed, you know. So they're doing different things like that. The other thing is that if you have a person that has the anxiety and can't, you know, wear the mask, the issue is, hey, you could do one or two things, right? You don't have to let them in the door, okay? And they're coming in voluntarily, just like everybody else. Or the church can have a section in their sanctuary saying, hey, these people are higher risk because they don't have a mask, or they're over 65, and this is the section that they're going to be sitting in. Just different ways to be creative to do it. I mean, the parking lot itself is got to be manned to make sure that, every other space is being taken. And just everybody directing people every which way, along with the arrows on the pavement showing them, hey, this is the way we're going, and so forth. But see, what's important is that we follow the guidelines, because if we don't, it puts the church at a greater risk of liability.
Thanks, Ken. I'm so glad that you're able to join us. We had a lot of questions about the insurance angle, right out of the gate with some of the first questions that I hadn't even thought of. So I was glad that we had to bring you in to address those. There's a lot of details that you mentioned, the hymnals, greeting cards, things like that. A lot of that guidance will be in some of the links that we're sending out, some of that from Brotherhood Mutual. We got the CDC website. They have some provisional guidelines for churches. So we'll make sure that gets out there as well. He also mentioned about churches being able to refuse access to people who just aren't cooperating with wearing a mask. If the church says this is our mask policy, if someone refuses to go along with that, just in general, they have the right to refuse admittance. But that is actually specifically in the workplace standards for churches. The churches have the right to refuse admission. So there's no question. You as a church have the right to tell someone, look, this is our policy. If you don't want to abide by it, we're going to have to ask you to come back at some future time, but not today. So good. I know we're pretty much out of time for the amount of time that I asked our presenters to be here. So if they have to drop off, we certainly appreciate them coming in, but I'll stick around for as long as it takes to answer whatever questions people have. Do any of our panelists have anything that they want to say at this point before we kind of turn to questions?
Andrew, I might just add that on next Tuesday, Copani, the Fellowship of Latino Pastors of New England, in cooperation with a couple of other pastors of larger churches, larger Hispanic churches, will be offering a similar kind of event, more directed to the specifics of Latino culture and the limitations of Latino churches and so on in the area, precisely to answer questions and concerns, and to just stress further the need for carefulness and great competency as we open our churches, just because we have so many people looking over our shoulders. So that'll be this coming next Tuesday at 10 a.m. There will be a time of prayer, and then 10:30 the webinar itself will begin, and we will be sending out information about that. But that may be another way that Latinos can compensate for language difficulties. And the translation is wonderful. We're so grateful to MFI for providing that. But there will be another opportunity for a more culturally targeted, let's say, approach next Tuesday through Copani. So we'll keep people informed about that.
That's great. We'll get the details and put that in the email as well, Pastor.
And by the way, thank you so much, MFI. I mean, I have to say, as someone who was involved right from the very beginning at this effort, your spirit, your collaborative attitude, your humility, decisive leadership, all these things have been so instrumental in making this possible. I'm sure that we're not 100% instrumental, but you guys really made all the difference, and I'm so thankful for MFI, and we encourage you to continue your extraordinary leadership. Thank you on behalf of all the pastors.
Thank you. Keep praying for us, and it's just an encouragement to Mike and to me to be able to work alongside of you and hopefully help make a little bit of a difference. Great.
Andrew,
James, did you have something or? No.
Nope, I thought this was extremely informative and encouraging to hear that the thoughtfulness of panelists and all the pastors on this call that people are actually taking this seriously, thinking through it and doing things the right way. Like I said to you before, I think it speaks to this. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And I think that goes into what people are thinking about right now. What can we do? What should we do? And how do we do it correctly? But thank you for having me. Thank you for everybody for being here and talking about all these issues and trying to find out the best way to move forward.
Allow me one last intervention because of its importance. One of the documents that you provided, Michael and Andrew, is from Lancaster Baptist Church.
Yeah.
And it's in one of your mailings. I think that's such an extraordinarily useful document, which answers so many questions that we have, done by a church that evidently has huge capacity to do this kind of thing. Very thoughtful, very professional. And, it is exhaustive, I think, in terms of all the different issues of reopening that it covers. And it will make you appear like a genius if you use it and use parts of it, cannibalize it. I think that is open, and they've been so generous in providing that. But I really want to stress, go to that document by Lancaster Baptist Church, because it's extraordinarily helpful in helping us to just put things down in a very eloquent form of how to proceed about this professionally. So take a look at it. I really stress that you do that. And thank you for providing it, guys.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that was helpful, and we'll make sure that a link to that is in the email we send out. I think it's about 20 megabytes in size, pretty substantial. Mike, do we have questions that we can address?
Yeah, and I was also going to say too, while the panelists are still with us, that we'd love to send out an email to everyone with all this information, as well as if the panelists are okay with it, your information to get in touch with if it's an insurance question, if it's a medical question, if it's a legal question. I'm assuming that's going to be okay with the panelists. Is that good?
Sure. Yep.
So yeah, some of the questions were just about some of the legal questions. If a church takes temperature and someone refuses, what legal aspect could affect the church?
I mean, legally, I would put that in the same category as someone who refuses to wear a face mask, if that's the church's policy. I mean, really, that needs to be their policy for at least entering and exiting the face mask. If churches decide to do temperature and someone refuses to do that, it's within the church's purview to then refuse them admission.
This is where, Andrew, each church has to have a written policy. It has to put it in writing. And, it's all about documentation on what are you doing to back up what you're doing. The other thing is I would be taking pictures of everything that's happening around the church. So it's not only down in writing, but you can show pictures of the congregation, being 6 feet apart, or this is our hand sanitizer. And so documentation is a key when we're dealing with this.
I think it's critical to be able to make sure that people are all on the same page as they're coming in, because people, even we had discussions about passing the peace. People feel politically about that. We had a socially distant barbecue in our backyard with some folks, and somebody texted me on the way over and said, just so you know, I don't believe in social distancing. And I wrote back and I just said, just so you know, the other family does. So, you don't want to, we don't want to make this a divisive issue. And I think that the more that you can articulate that policy and just sort of saying, look, we are covenanting to engage in this kind of behavior with these kind of guardrails beforehand, so that you can kind of help to moderate those things before they become issues. But it's important to manage those expectations before you get into the sanctuary, and you then have to deal with them because you didn't really articulate what those policies were.
That's right. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges I know a lot of pastors are facing. And, I've faced it too, in the sense that we have people we work with that we're trying to lead, that we're very close to personally, who are on sort of hey, we should open churches 3 weeks ago. I'm not scared. I'm not wearing a face mask. And then you also have people that say, I'm not coming out of my house till there's a vaccine, and kind of everything in between. And I know, Pastor Miranda, you and I talked early on about trying to manage when you've got people that, usually are very much in alignment on sort of what we need to be in alignment on as a church or organization, who are just not on the same page with this thing. And that changes, week to week, who's where. Any Rich or Rand, anybody else, any advice on sort of how to lead when your people are just in different places?
I mean, yeah, just while we want to do what the governor tells us what we can do, we are called to a higher authority than our governor. We have a more strict obligation to our flock spiritually, and there are higher consequences than getting a fine or whatever in terms of getting somebody infected or subjected to hurt. So I just would just underscore, don't underprepare. Really just plan and have a good script. Plan for the best and just kind of stay there.
As a pastoral guide, I would suggest 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and maybe we can use that as a sermon point of departure on what happens. Really, how do we pastor diverse congregations that see things differently? People who are very careful about medicine and information and science, and others who are more sort of faith-oriented and more, fiery on certain issues, or are suspicious of government and so on and so forth. And this diversity that we have in our churches, which, by the way, the state and secular groups are often not willing to acknowledge the fact that we are very dynamic, diverse communities. It's important to take that into account pastorally. So I think this idea of, food offered to idols and all of that, how people stand on different sides, can be applied to this situation where some people say, hey, let's go for it. And others who say, no, let's be very careful about this. They have a tender conscience, so to speak. And I think it's important to take a passage like that and use it to encourage people to respect each other and to acknowledge the validity of different points of views, and to use it as an opportunity really for us pastors to encourage those values of tolerance and kindness, among our people. So that may be a good point of a departure. And I think it's important also for us when we are conducting our services. Now there's a double complexity for pastors. Now we are doing live streaming at times, and now we're being forced also to get back into the dynamic of one-on-one, in-person kind of a dynamic. So we are now addressing two fronts, and I know that that's kind of irritating for some pastors. But it's important, when we have our service, to continue referring to those that are staying home, to validate their presence, to acknowledge them in a sermon or during the announcements, even as we address those that are physically present, in order to address an issue, which is that those people who decide to stay home will be feeling, inevitably, some will be feeling a little bit guilty and doubtful about themselves. Am I having enough faith or not? I think it's important to address that issue. And interestingly enough, I think that they may also be a little irritated against their pastors that are putting them down in the position of appearing less confident in the Lord and having to prove themselves. And I think it's important for pastors to be very proactive in affirming those individuals before the rest of the congregation, and letting people know that, no, these are strong believers that happen to think differently than we do. So I think that's an important point as well to keep in mind. And also, I think for those members of our congregation that are extremely, again, resistant to the idea of going back to church, and who feel that it may be even slightly irresponsible, it behooves us to lean the other way and appearing, and in reality, being careful, being very prudent, very sober, respecting authorities, planning, reflecting, taking in different points of view, because that'll only inure to our credibility and to our authority as pastors.
And I'd like to just mention about the importance of children during this time. A lot of families are in such distress and such chaos in their own family unit, that to remember that the churches that are doing live stream for children and videos for children, just making sure that we're not forgetting the little people and the teenagers, and trying to reach out and touch families that have children is extremely important, especially in this time.
Andrew, there's a couple questions here just in regard to schools. What if a school is part of a church and they want to have a graduation?
Well, yeah, so the order doesn't apply to churches. They're in a subsequent phase. Good question. Maybe if the graduation ceremony is sort of interjected into a worship service at a church. Yeah, I'm not sure. That's something we have to think through. Definitely some potential there. Maybe I can talk one-on-one with that pastor offline.
Okay. And what about home churches?
Yeah, so the order doesn't really countenance difference between sort of a church with its own dedicated building and home churches. So just in general, I think home churches would be as free to operate as a standalone church, and perhaps more so because they're in that sort of domestic context. Yeah, so I guess they would either, if they're under 10 people, then none of these orders would apply to them. If they're over 10 people, but doing it in a home as a church, then I think these orders would apply to them. The requirements for social distancing and otherwise. But that's something I'd want to kind of think through the details. So again, I'd be happy to talk to that person one-on-one.
I think it's really good, though, for a church to give language to people that are either having they're meeting in small groups or they're meeting in home churches. Well, the letter of the law may not apply to them. I think that the spiritual gist of it, that we don't want to cause anyone else harm, would still apply. And so I would still recommend taking the same precautions to make sure, if anyone is, experiencing any cold symptoms, they should opt out. You should, do so in a way where you can maintain proper social distancing. I mean, I think that those guidelines would be, we don't want anyone in our flock, regardless of whether they're in their sanctuary or whether they're meeting in their homes, to be subjected to a higher risk. So I think it would help for churches to give language to your small groups, your home churches, your people that are meeting in small gatherings, just on how to do so in a way that's prudent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're a house church, I don't think you have to have the certification poster on your kitchen, on your refrigerator, but certainly all the social distancing, masks, everything, all that health related stuff, you're going to want to do that as well to the extent possible.
Also, Andrew, what about youth ministry and children's ministry?
I think the majority of that's going to fall under the prohibition of having, no child care or children, to look at the specific language, but, no child care in the services. Because again, the overriding guidance or requirement is that social distancing. And if you can't social distance, then masks. And, my kids are 4, 10, 15, and 16, and social distancing is hard with all of them. And the younger you get, the harder it is. So, having a children's church or something like that, I don't think it's going to be permitted by the order. And anything that's specifically child care, and that can be a fine line, is definitely not permitted. I like Marlene's idea of having the drive-in church once a month or so that it makes it easier for parents with kids. I know my son's youth pastors have been doing, it's a Zoom call once a week, and doing youth ministry that way, and it tends to work pretty well actually. But I think in person, if just in general, my sense is if the child is young enough that they can't socially distance themselves, that's probably a no-go. But middle school, high school, can they be in sort of a just spread out classroom type setting during a church service? Probably. Again, the underlying is can you social distance consistently and effectively?
For drive-ins, is there a requirement? When people are in their cars, for example, is there a requirement between cars?
No, there's no specific requirements or guidelines on drive-in churches. That falls under the original order prohibits most assembling over 10, but that did not apply to gatherings that were in parking lots or parks. So, a lot of churches would have a parking space or two in between cars, windows all the way up, 2/3 of the way up. But that was all driven by the church's desire to do things that were safe. If you're 6 feet or more apart and you're outside, there's no other orders or guidelines that I've seen from the state other than maintaining that 6 feet apart when you're outside. But there's no numerical limit or extra guidance.
And lastly, I think there's some questions here just in regard to, are these guidelines, are these recommendations, are these mandatory? Just kind of speak to that in general. Obviously, we've gone over so many details, obviously erring on the side of safety in this webinar. But what do you say to those that have that overarching question, guidelines versus mandatory?
Sure. Well, sort of two answers to that. The first answer is if you look at this 2-page PDF. Again, this is something we're going to be sending out links to. It's from the governor's website. This was the first thing that kind of got leaked out Sunday night. 4 churches. It's the safety standards in kind of an infographic format. It's easy to process. And here they actually differentiate, as I read it, this text, I don't know if you can see that highlighted on the screen share, but the text at the top here that's got a white background, that's an order. The text in gray, as I scroll down, that's recommendations, and it even says recommended there. I apologize, my screen share maybe not quite tracking with what I'm seeing. Okay, so if you see the gray portion says recommended, so it does differentiate pretty clearly on this document. That's one answer. The second answer is how much of this stuff is actually enforceable in court with constitutional scrutiny. We're not sure at this point. I know there's still pending litigation in federal court out of Worcester with Pastor Casey, who's been holding church. Again, social distancing, face masks, all that, but was holding church even under the old order. I don't know if this new order is going to be litigated. I guess just on a practical level, my hope is, if we all kind of just work together, go along with it for now, hopefully in a few weeks or a month or so, we don't have to figure out what the enforceability is. Because we just want to all get through this together. But I totally understand, the legal and constitutional concerns that it can present. We'll be keeping a close eye on how enforcement looks from the states, and if a new lawsuit or an amended lawsuit seems appropriate in order to make sure the government isn't overstepping its bounds, too much or longer than it should. I can assure you we'll be looking towards that. But I think for now, I haven't seen anything that's too onerous or that's really beyond what most churches are going to want to do to be safe anyways. So if there are any specific items that people are concerned about that they don't think they can do in good conscience, again, happy to talk about the specifics of that.
Yeah, and I would just repeat, echo what you said, Andrew, that I think it's important for all pastors to realize that there's a difference between the government being penalizing, churches regarding this, and then there's the just being socially responsible as a church, right? And so definitely, as you said, maybe 3-4 weeks, who knows, but more to come for sure on that issue.
All right, anything else, Mike?
So I think that does it for the questions. Again, we'll be sending out information by email, and wanted to just reiterate again what Pastor Zenzo said, that it is a big deal that churches are not only part of phase 1 but part of phase 1 of phase 1, and just to be reminded that our religious liberties are so important, and we do need to come together, in times like this, not to raise our voice because we're trying to be intentionally civilly disobedient in any way or come against our government, but many times our government needs to be reminded of these rights, these inalienable rights, these God-given rights that we do have. And there's that balance, like I said, between rights and being socially responsible. So we just want to say a big thank you to the over 500 pastors that signed that letter to the governor. A big thank you to the over 600 people that left a comment on the Reopen Advisory Board webpage. Just a big thank you to everybody that called the governor's office. It really has made a huge difference. And for a state like Massachusetts to be one of, leading the way regarding religious liberty is really quite something, and is a testament to the local church. So we're humbled to be a part of that in Massachusetts.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Mike. Thank you for our panelists and for everyone who tuned in. I know we're well over that hour and a half mark that we said we'd be, so I want to let everyone go. And like we said, we'll be sending out all the links we talked about today shortly in an email to everyone who registered. And feel free to contact us anytime with follow-up questions. We're here to serve the church in Massachusetts.
Thank you.
All right. Have a blessed day.
You too.
Thank you all. God bless. Bye.